The fiddle music soared through the thick, beer-soaked air of the Harmony Creek saloon, but for Silas Blackwood, it was just another sound in the dark. He stood against the rough-hewn wall, one hand resting on the warm, steady head of his golden retriever, Sundown, the other holding a polished hickory walking stick. Two simple black patches covered the spaces where his eyes had been, turning his face into a mask of polite stillness. He had been standing there for the better part of an hour, a solitary island in a swirling sea of calico dresses and dusty boots. 3 songs had come and gone. He'd heard the boisterous calls of the square dance, the shuffle of feet, the breathless laughter of women being spun too fast. No one approached him. The single women of Harmony Creek, mostly hardy widows and weary daughters of ranchers, would glance his way, their gazes catching on the black patches before skittering away as if they'd touched a hot stove. The men just ignored him, a piece of furniture they had to walk around. He was a fixture in town, Silas the blind prospector, a man defined by what he had lost. Pity was a wall thicker than stone, and tonight, it felt a dozen feet high. Sundown shifted at his feet, letting out a soft whine, and nudged his hand. Silas scratched behind the dog's ears. "Easy, boy. They're just dancing," but the dog wasn't looking at the dancers. His head was turned toward the saloon's swinging doors. Then, the noise of the room changed. It was subtle at first, a dip in the boisterous hum, a faltering in the fiddle's tune. The laughter didn't stop, but it became more pointed, laced with murmurs. A new presence had entered the room, one even more out of place than a blind man at a barn dance. Silas couldn't see her, but he could feel the shift in the air, the way the current of the crowd eddied around a new obstacle. He smelled a faint, clean scent cutting through the grime of sweat and whiskey, something like jasmine tea and summer rain. Then he heard the rustle of fabric, not the coarse whisper of cotton or wool, but the smooth, fluid sound of silk. The murmuring grew louder, a nest of hornets stirred with a stick. He heard a man's voice, low and contemptuous. "Look what the railroad left behind." A path cleared. The rustling of silk came closer, stopping directly in front of him. A profound silence fell, so complete that the fiddler's bow screeched to a halt mid-note. Every eye in the saloon was fixed on the space before him. A woman's voice, quiet but clear, spoke. "Pardon me, sir," the words were precise, carrying a melody that was not from around these parts. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Silas felt his throat go dry. He must have misheard. This had to be a cruel joke, the kind bored men played on the afflicted. Sundown, however, sat up straighter, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the floorboards. Silas managed, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "My name is Leanne," she said. "And I have not danced in a very long time. The music is quite lovely." He could feel the heat of 100 stares boring into his back. He could practically hear the thoughts behind them, the Chinese widow, asking the blind man to dance. It was an absurdity, a spectacle. But there was no mockery in her tone. There was only a simple, direct request. Slowly, as if testing the weight of the air, a small, warm hand settled on his. It was delicate but firm. The crowd let out a collective, held breath. For the first time all night, someone had reached across the wall of pity and touched him. Silas tightened his grip, his calloused fingers closing around hers. "I'm not much of a dancer anymore," he said, his voice low. "I'm liable to step on your feet." "Then I will have to be quicker," she replied, a hint of a smile in her voice. "Shall we?" He nodded, a single, jerky motion. With his walking stick in one hand and Leanne's hand in the other, he let her guide him toward the center of the floor. The silence was a physical thing now, heavy and judgmental. He felt like a man walking to the gallows. He could hear the floorboards creaking under their feet, the nervous cough from the bar, the sharp intake of breath from a woman nearby. He imagined the sight they must make, the tall, scarred man in patched denim led by the small woman in a dress the color of a sunrise. Leanne stopped them in the middle of the empty dance floor. She gently took his stick and leaned it against his leg, then placed his free hand on her waist. Her other hand found its place on his shoulder. "Fiddler," she called out, her voice unwavering. A waltz, if you please." For a moment, there was no response. Then, a man's gruff voice bellowed from the edge of the room. "Play the song, Henry. Let's see the show." A ripple of cruel laughter followed. The fiddle began a hesitant, mournful tune, a far cry from the lively music of moments before. Silas's posture stiffened. This was a mistake. He was bringing his own humiliation down upon this woman, this stranger. But then she moved. "Just follow me," she whispered. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 He was clumsy at first, his feet stumbling, his balance unsure. He was used to navigating the world through sound and touch, but the shifting, rhythmic space of a dance was a foreign country. He felt the tension in his shoulders, the shame burning his cheeks. He was about to pull away, to end this foolishness, but her hand on his shoulder was a steady anchor. Her guidance was gentle but certain. "You are listening to the music," she said softly, her breath near his ear. "Listen to my feet instead. They know the song." He closed his mind to the fiddle and the snickering crowd. He focused on the faint slide and tap of her slippers on the wooden floor, the subtle pressure of her hand guiding his turn, the slight shift in her weight that told him when to step. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm found its way from his ears to his feet. His steps became less of a shuffle and more of a glide. He was no longer stumbling. He was dancing. The quality of the room's attention changed. The snickers died down, replaced by a grudging curiosity. The fiddle player, perhaps caught up in the strange dignity of the moment, found his rhythm too. The waltz grew stronger, fuller. For a few brief minutes, they were not the town's outcasts. They were just a man and a woman, turning in time to the music under the smoky lamplight. The dance ended. The final note of the fiddle hung in the air, and the silence that followed was different. It was no longer hostile. It was stunned. Before anyone could break the spell, a heavy tread approached them. A voice, slick with false politeness, cut through the quiet. "Well now, isn't that a touching display?" Silas knew that voice. Jebediah Barrett. The man who owned the saloon, the largest ranch in the territory, and, Silas suspected, the soul of every man who worked for him. "Mrs. Way," Barrett said, his voice oozing condescension. "I admire your charitable spirit. But this is a place for celebration, not for pity." "I was not offering pity, Mr. Barrett," Leanne replied, her voice as cool and smooth as river stone. I was enjoying a dance. She had not let go of Silas's hand. "Be that as it may," Barrett continued, stepping closer. Silas could smell the expensive cigar on his breath. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with a partner who can see what a lovely picture you make." He was trying to dismiss Silas, to brush him aside like a piece of refuse. This was the moment Silas had been dreading. The moment the world would remind him of his place. He felt a familiar knot of anger and helplessness tighten in his gut. But before he could retreat into himself, Leanne's grip on his hand tightened. It was a small, defiant gesture, but it sent a shock of strength through him. He lifted his head, aiming his patched eyes in the direction of Barrett's voice. "The lady asked me to dance, Mr. Barrett," Silas said, his voice even and low, but carrying across the silent room. "And she hasn't asked me to stop." A low growl rumbled from the floor. Sundown had padded silently to his side and was now standing with his head lowered, a faint tremor in his chest. Barrett chuckled, a sound devoid of any humor. "Your dog has more sense than you do, Blackwood. Knows when to be quiet." He turned his attention back to Leanne. "I suggest you return to your side of town, Mrs. Way, before you cause any more disruption." The threat was unmistakable. Leanne's side of town was the collection of shacks near the railroad tracks where the Chinese laborers lived, a place most of Harmony Creek pretended did not exist. But Leanne did not flinch. She simply met the rancher's gaze, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Barrett," she said. "But my husband taught me to finish what I start." With that, she turned her back on the most powerful man in the county and gently squeezed Silas's hand. "It is warm in here," she said, her voice for his ears only. "Perhaps some air." She led him away from the dance floor, past the gawking faces and the simmering fury of Jebediah Barrett. As they pushed through the swinging doors and into the warm summer night, Silas knew one thing for certain. This was about more than just a dance. He had a feeling it had been about more than that from the moment she first spoke his name. Outside, the air was a relief, smelling of dust and distant pines instead of stale beer. The saloon's noise was a muffled thrum behind them. They found a wooden bench against the building's side, and Silas sat, sundown immediately settling at his feet with a contented sigh. Leanne sat beside him, the silk of her dress whispering against the rough wood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space after the storm of the saloon. "You shouldn't have done that," Silas said finally, breaking the quiet. "Barrett is not a man to cross." "My husband crossed him," Leanne said, her voice losing its formal edge, becoming softer, sadder. "And now he is dead." The words hung in the night air. Silas turned his head toward her. "The railroad accident," he stated. It wasn't a question. "There was no accident," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband, Wei, he was a foreman for the Central Pacific. He was in charge of the blasting crew cutting a new grade through the hills on Barrett's land. He was a good man, a careful man. He knew the mountains. He knew the black powder." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "One day, he came home to our small room. He was excited. He said he had found something. Not for the railroad. Something for us. A line of blue-streaked quartz in the rock, the kind his grandfather had told him to look for. Silver." Silas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He knew this story. He had lived a version of it himself. He filed a preliminary claim marker at the land office, Leanne continued. Just a small notice, to hold the spot. He drew a map on the back of the paper. He was going to save his wages, buy the claim properly when the railroad moved on. But 2 days later, there was a blast. They said he misjudged the fuse. They said he was too close. And Barrett was there to offer his condolences, Silas finished for her, his voice bitter. "And a little money to see you on your way." He heard her sharp intake of breath. "How did you know?" "Because he did the same for me," or the words came out before he could stop them, a truth he hadn't spoken aloud to another soul in 5 years. "Barrett was my partner, a long time ago. We were prospectors. We found a strike, not far from here. A real one. Enough to make us both rich. The day we were to file the claim together, he set a charge in the mine shaft while I was still inside. Said he shouted a warning I never heard. He lifted a hand and touched the edge of one of his eye patches. The blast didn't kill me. It just took my sight and buried me alive. By the time I dug myself out, Barrett had filed the claim in his name alone. He told everyone I'd been careless, a tragic accident. He even paid for the doctor who patched me up. Charity, he called it. The night was still again, but now the silence was filled with a shared history, a shared enemy. Leanne reached into a sleeve of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper. The crisp sound of it unfolding was loud in the quiet. "This is the marker Wei filed," she said. "I cannot read all the English. Just his name, and the date. The clerk at the office said it was invalid now, that Barrett had filed a proper geological survey over the same land a month ago. He said Wei's paper was worthless. "Let me," Silas said, holding out his hand. She placed the paper in his palm. He couldn't see the words, but his fingers, trained by years of reading the earth, traced the map on the back. It was a simple drawing, lines and symbols scratched into the paper. But to Silas, it was as clear as a surveyor's chart. He felt the familiar curve of a riverbed, the sharp angle of a granite ridge he knew as well as his own face. A jolt went through him. "Sweet heavens," he whispered. "I know this place. This marker, it's less than 100 yards from my old claim. From Barrett's main mine. They both understood at once. Way hadn't just found a new vein. He had found the continuation of the same lode Barrett had stolen from Silas, a part of it that extended beyond Barrett's legal claim. And Barrett had killed him for it. The saloon doors swung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light onto the dusty street. A large, hulking figure detached itself from the doorway and lumbered toward them. It was one of Barrett's foremen, a man named Riggs. "Barrett wants a word with the lady," Riggs growled, stopping a few feet from the bench. His shadow fell over them. "He says your dancing card is full for the night." "Time to go home." The way he said home made it sound like a cage. Sundown was on his feet in an instant, a low, menacing growl deep in his chest. "I will leave when I am ready," Leanne said, her voice steady despite the man's size. Riggs took a step closer, his hand dropping to the heavy pistol on his hip. "I don't think you understand. That wasn't a request." Silas stood up slowly, his hickory stick held loosely in his hand. He was a head taller than Riggs, but the man was wider, built of solid muscle. "The lady is with me," Silas said calmly. Riggs laughed, a short, ugly bark. "With you? What are you gonna do, Blackwood? Tap me to death?" Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, a blind man and his dog, between a lone woman and a man twice as strong. But he was not the same man who had stood inside the saloon, waiting to be ignored. The fire that Barrett had tried to extinguish in that mine shaft 5 years ago was not entirely out. Leanne's courage had been the breath of air it needed. For months later, the dust of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Silas and Leanne stood before the counter at the Territorial Land Office in the county seat, a full day's ride from Harmony Creek. The air inside smelled of dry paper and sealing wax. The clerk, a small man with a green visor, took a heavy brass stamp and brought it down on a thick document with a satisfying thud. "There you have it," the clerk said, peering over his spectacles. "The claim is registered to both of you. Blackwood and Way. Barrett's protest has been officially overruled by the territorial marshal." It had not been easy. Leanne had sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal's office, a gamble that had cost nearly all the money she had left. She had laid out the story of her husband's claim and Barrett's suspicious subsequent filing. When the marshal arrived, Silas provided a sworn statement, his memory of the land and its geology so precise that it gave weight to Leanne's story. He described the rock formations, the water sources, the exact location of his old, stolen claim in relation to Way's map. The final piece had come from a man named Chen, another of Way's crew. Emboldened by the marshal's presence, he came forward and confessed that Barrett had paid him to stay quiet, had threatened his family back in California if he spoke of the silver Way had found. The combination of Way's marker, Silas's testimony, and Chen's confession was enough. They could not prove murder, but they proved claim jumping beyond a doubt. Jebediah Barrett was forced to relinquish his claim on the new lode. His power in Harmony Creek, built on a foundation of lies, had begun to crumble. Now, Silas and Leanne stood on the porch of a small, sturdy cabin built from fresh-cut pine. It sat on a slope overlooking the creek that ran through their shared claim. The afternoon sun was warm on Silas's face. He no longer wore the black patches, having traded them for a pair of dark spectacles that simply shaded what was left of his eyes. Sundown lay sleeping at his feet, his golden coat bright in the sunlight. Leanne came to stand beside him, the scent of jasmine tea clinging to her. He heard the soft rustle of her dress, a sound that was no longer strange but was now the sound of home. "The wind is coming from the north," he said, turning his face toward the breeze. "Winter will be here soon." "We have enough wood chopped," she replied. "And the cellar is stocked. We will be fine." They had worked together, a partnership born of necessity and forged in trust. He had the knowledge of the land, she the sharp mind for business and the unwavering will. He taught her how to read the rocks, and she read him the newspapers and legal documents, her voice giving him sight. In the evenings, she would describe the sunset to him in such detail he felt he could almost see the colors. He reached out, and his hand found her arm. "There's a dance in town tonight," he said. "I heard the fiddler is the same one." Leanne placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and familiar. "We have our own music here, Silas," she said softly. He smiled. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the pines and the gentle murmur of the creek. It was a better song than any fiddle could play. It was the sound of a life they had built together, a quiet testament to the fact that sometimes, the most courageous act is simply reaching out a hand in a silent room. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.